The gun was already drawn when Marcus Quinn walked through the door of the Dusty River Saloon, and every soul in that room went rigid with fear, every soul except one. Mary Whitaker did not move. She did not flinch. She did not drop her glass, did not push back her chair, did not lower her eyes. She simply looked at him the way a person looks at a thunderstorm approaching across the plains, with full awareness of its power, full recognition of its danger, and not a single trembling bone in her body. Marcus Quinn noticed. He noticed the way you notice a firefly in a room full of candles. He noticed the way you notice silence in the middle of a gunfight. He stood there in the doorway of that saloon with his Colt revolver raised, and the whole of Redemption, Texas holding its collective breath, and his eyes dark as the bottom of a dry well, found her face and stayed there. She was wearing a blue dress that had seen better days, her dark hair pinned up with a single ivory comb, a half-empty glass of sarsaparilla on the table in front of her. She was 26 years old, and she looked like the kind of woman who had already survived everything the world had thought to throw at her. The man Marcus had come to collect his debt from a sweating, red-faced cattle broker named Holt Ferris was cowering behind the bar with both hands over his head. 3 other men had their backs pressed to the far wall. The piano player had stopped mid-note. Even the saloon dog, a mangy yellow hound who usually slept through everything, had retreated under a table. But Mary Whitaker sat with her spine straight and her chin up and her eyes locked on Marcus Quinn like he was nothing more or less than a man she had not yet decided what to think of. He lowered his gun, not entirely, not with any softness. He lowered it by maybe 2 inches, which was enough for the room to exhale, but his eyes never left her face. That moment, that specific, electric, inexplicable moment was the one Marcus Quinn would carry with him for the rest of his life. He did not know her name yet. He did not know her story. He knew nothing about Mary Whitaker except that she was the only woman in that room who had not flinched when he walked through the door, and that fact lodged itself in his chest like a splinter he could not find and could not forget. But he was getting ahead of himself. They both were. To understand how Marcus Quinn ended up pointing a gun inside the Dusty River Saloon on that October evening in 1878, and how Mary Whitaker came to be sitting alone at that particular table, you had to go back 6 weeks, to the day she arrived in Redemption on the morning stage from Abilene. Redemption, Texas was not a town that tried very hard to live up to its name. It sat at the edge of a dry creek bed that ran water maybe 3 months out of 12, surrounded by flat, sun-baked land that stretched to the horizon in every direction with nothing to interrupt it except scrub brush, the occasional rattlesnake, and the rusted remains of a wagon someone had abandoned during the big drought of 1870. The town had a post office, a general store, a livery stable, a church that was also a school, a blacksmith, and the Dusty River Saloon, which served as the social hub for everyone who did not attend Sunday services, and a fair number who did. What Redemption also had was a railroad surveying crew that had arrived the previous summer with serious talk about laying track through the county, and with those surveyors had come land disputes, forged deeds, ambitious men with dangerous intentions, and enough tension to make the air feel thick even on cool days. Mary Whitaker had come to Redemption for a job. She had answered a notice in the Abilene paper placed by a Dr. Elias Pratt, who needed a trained nurse to assist with his practice and help tend to a growing population that was outpacing one elderly physician's ability to keep up. Mary had trained under a doctor in St. Louis for 2 years after her parents died of typhoid fever in 1874, and she had spent the intervening years moving from town to town, following work, never staying long enough in any place to call it home. She had no husband and no plans to find one. She had told herself this firmly and often enough that she almost believed it. The morning she arrived, The stage lurched to a stop in front of the general store, and Mary climbed down with a single leather trunk and a carpet bag, smoothed her skirt, and looked around at Redemption with the calm, assessing eye of a woman who had arrived in worse places and expected she might arrive in worse ones still. Dr. Pratt met her at the stage. He was a small, kind-eyed man of about 60 with a white beard and the permanently tired expression of someone who had not slept a full night in years. He shook her hand firmly and said he was deeply glad she had come, and she believed him. "I should warn you," he said as he led her down the main street toward his office, which was attached to the front of his house near the far end of town, "that this is not a quiet place just at present. There is some trouble brewing over land and railroad rights. Some of the men involved are not the kind who settle disagreements with conversation." "I understand," Mary said. "There is one man in particular," Dr. Pratt continued, lowering his voice as though someone on the empty street might hear him, "who has something of a reputation. Marcus Quinn. He runs the Quinn land holdings northeast of town. His father built the ranch, but the father has been gone 4 years now, and Marcus has been fighting to hold onto what's his ever since. He is not a criminal, I want to be clear on that. But he is not a man to be trifled with, and the situation with the railroad surveyors and a man named Silas Crane has pushed him to the edge of something I fear." Mary stored the name away without comment. Marcus Quinn. She had no reason to think she would encounter him, and even if she did, men with dangerous reputations were not new to her experience. She settled into the small room at the back of Dr. Pratt's house, arranged her few belongings, and began working the very next morning. The work was familiar and grounding. She cleaned wounds, assisted with a difficult tooth extraction, prepared medicines from Dr. Pratt's supplies, kept his records in order, and visited patients in their homes when they could not come to the office. Within a week, she had learned every family in Redemption by name and ailment. She also learned more about the situation Dr. Pratt had mentioned. It was impossible not to. The town was divided into quiet factions, people who sided with the railroad interests represented by Silas Crane, a sharp-eyed businessman from Houston who had arrived with legal papers and a hired gun of his own, and people who sided with the ranchers and homesteaders who had worked this land for decades and did not intend to be bought out or pushed out. Marcus Quinn was the most visible face of the opposition to Crane. He owned the largest parcel of land in the county, and the proposed railroad route would cut directly through the heart of it. If the route was approved and the land seized under disputed eminent domain claims, he would lose not just income, but the thing his father had spent 30 years building, and the thing Marcus had spent 4 years defending. She heard about him constantly without meeting him. She heard that he was 32 years old, that he was hard-working and honest in his business dealings but dangerous when cornered, that he had a loyal crew of ranch hands who would follow him into trouble if he asked. She heard from Alois Crane, Silas's young wife who had come to see Mary about a persistent headache, that Marcus Quinn was a criminal and a threat to progress. She heard from Mee Tibbet, the blacksmith's wife who had lived in Redemption 20 years, that Marcus Quinn was one of the finest men the county had produced, and that Silas Crane was the one people ought to be afraid of. Mary listened to all of it and reserved judgment. She had learned that the truth in any dispute was usually somewhere in the space between what both sides shouted about each other. She first saw Marcus Quinn at a distance, 10 days after her arrival, when he rode into town with 2 of his ranch hands to file documents at the land office that was temporarily housed in the post office. She was crossing the street from the general store when he passed on horseback, and she noticed him the way you notice a man who carries himself with a particular kind of contained intensity, not arrogance exactly, but the bearing of someone who is always slightly coiled, ready for whatever comes next. He was tall in the saddle, dark-haired, with the kind of weathered face that the Texas sun carved into men who spent their lives outdoors. He rode with easy confidence, and he was talking to one of his men in a low, serious tone, not looking around. He did not notice her. She noticed him because of the quality of his stillness even in motion. There was no wasted movement in him. Everything he did seemed deliberate. She did not see him again for another 2 weeks. In that time, the situation in Redemption deteriorated steadily. Silas Crane had produced additional documentation supporting his claim that portions of the Quinn Ranch were built on land never properly titled under Texas law during the period of the Republic. Marcus Quinn had responded by hiring an attorney from San Antonio named Franklin Webb, who argued forcefully that the titles were valid. The dispute moved from angry conversations at the feed store to a formal hearing scheduled at the county seat in Hartley in 3 weeks' time. But Silas Crane, Mary had come to understand, was not the kind of man who was content to wait for legal processes. She learned this concretely when his hired man, a lean, cold-eyed individual named Decker, broke 2 of the fingers on Franklin Webb's right hand in what was reported as an accident at the stable. Webb left town the following morning and did not return. Marcus Quinn appeared at Dr. Pratt's office the next afternoon. Mary was alone, Dr. Pratt having gone to deliver a baby at the Henderson farm 4 miles out. She was at the examination table, arranging surgical instruments when the door opened, and she looked up and there he was. Up close, the contained intensity she had noticed from across the street was even more pronounced. He filled the doorway not because he was particularly enormous, though he was well built and over 6 feet, but because of the quality of attention he brought into a room with him. His jaw was tight. His eyes moved around the room quickly and found her and stopped. "Dr. Pratt," he asked. "Out on a call," she said. "I'm his nurse, Mary Whitaker. Can I help you?" He looked at her for a moment as if reassessing the situation, then stepped fully inside. He was holding his left forearm. She could see a dark stain on his sleeve. "Sit down," she said, moving toward him. "What happened?" "Wire fence," he said. "On my property. Someone cut it last night and left the ends curled in the grass where the horses would walk through it." She guided him to the chair beside the examination table, took his arm, rolled up his sleeve carefully. The cut was deep from wrist to mid-forearm, the kind of wound a barbed wire edge made when it caught flesh moving at speed. It had bled considerably and was still seeping. "This needs cleaning and several stitches," she said. "Do what you need to do," he said. His voice was level. He watched her as she prepared the carbolic solution, and the needle and thread with the same focused attention he seemed to bring to everything. She had cleaned and sutured dozens of wounds. She worked quickly and precisely, and as she worked she felt him watching her, not with the discomfort that most men showed when being tended to, not with any attempt at conversation to distract himself, but with a steady, quiet attentiveness that was different from anything she had experienced in a clinical setting. "You are new here," he said after a while. A statement, not a question. 6 weeks, she said. "From?" "Most recently Abilene. Before that St. Louis, Wichita, 2 years in Kansas City. Moving frequently," he observed. "Work takes me where it takes me," she said, tying off the last stitch. He looked down at her work. "You are very good at this," he said. "Thank you," she said, not deflecting the compliment but also not elaborating. She began bandaging the arm. There was a quality to the silence between them that was unusual. It was not uncomfortable. It was not the silence of 2 strangers with nothing to say. It was more like the silence of 2 people who were each aware that the other was paying careful attention. "You know who I am," he said. Again, not a question. "I know your name and that you are in a dispute with Silas Crane over your land," she said. "I try not to know more about people's situations than is useful to me in helping them." Something shifted slightly in his expression. "That is a fair approach," he said. "Your attorney left town," she said. "I heard that." "Yes," he said. The single word carried everything. "You need a new one." "I am aware of that, a beat. I am also aware that Crane will do the same thing to any attorney who comes here, which means I need someone willing to represent me who Crane cannot easily frighten or harm." She tied off the bandage. "There is a woman attorney in Fort Worth," she said. "Clara Birch. She is one of the first women admitted to the Texas bar. Crane might hesitate before moving against a woman, if only because of the attention it would draw. He looked at her. The focused attention intensified. "How do you know about Clara Birch?" "I treated her sister in Abilene last year. She spoke of her often." Mary met his eyes steadily. "I can write to her if you like. She and I are on good terms." He was quiet for a long moment. She could almost see him measuring it, weighing the offer, weighing her. She was used to being assessed. She did not find it threatening. "Why would you do that?" he asked. "You have been in this town 6 weeks. This is not your fight." Injustice does not become less unjust because it is not happening to someone I have known long, she said simply. He stood then, looked at his bandaged arm, and then looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read, something between surprise and recognition, as though he had found something in an unexpected place and was not yet sure what to do about it. "I would be grateful for the letter," he said. "I will write it tonight," she said. He paid her, which she accepted without fuss, and left. She stood in the empty examination room for a moment after the door closed and realized that her heartbeat had not quite returned to its usual pace. She wrote the letter that evening. In the weeks that followed, Mary found herself drawn into the situation in redemption, not because she had planned it, but because she was constitutionally incapable of standing at a remove from something she considered unjust. She provided additional documentation to Marcus about land surveys she had found referenced in the county record books at the post office, where she had gone to retrieve a medical supply catalog and noticed them while waiting. She passed along information she overheard from Alois Crane during the woman's second and third visits for her headaches. Not gossip, but specific things about Crane's legal strategy that Mary believed Marcus had a right to know. Dr. Pratt watched this with the expression of a man who understood exactly what was happening and felt helpless to intercede with good conscience. "Mary," he said one evening over supper, "I worry about your safety." "I appreciate that," she said. "I am being careful." What she did not tell him was that she was also becoming increasingly aware, with every interaction, that Marcus Quinn occupied more of her thoughts than was strictly rational or professional. She argued with herself about this. He was a man in a dangerous situation, and the empathy she felt was the natural response of a compassionate person to someone being treated unjustly. It was not personal. But when he came to see her 3 times that first month, always with some practical purpose, once to have his wound checked, once to bring documents he wanted her to look at, once with the written response from Clara Birch in Fort Worth, who had agreed to take his case, she noticed that those visits were the clearest part of her days. She noticed that he listened to her as though what she said mattered, which was not as universal an experience as it should have been. She noticed that he never condescended and never performed charm, which were 2 of the things she disliked most in men. She noticed that he had a quiet sense of humor that surfaced rarely, but when it did was genuinely funny, dry and precise. She noticed that when he was worried, the worry showed around his eyes before it showed anywhere else, and that he worked very hard not to let it show anywhere else at all. She told herself that she was simply engaged with the situation and the people in it. She told herself that any resemblance to the feeling she had successfully avoided for 26 years was coincidental. Then came the evening at the Dusty River Saloon. Mary did not frequent the saloon. She went perhaps once a week, in the late afternoon when it was relatively quiet, because Mee Tibbet ran a small table in the back corner where she sold needlework patterns and fabric, and Mary needed to replace a skirt panel that had torn during a difficult delivery she had assisted with the previous week. She arrived at 5:30 on a Tuesday, bought her fabric, accepted a glass of sarsaparilla from the barman because Mee insisted on hospitality, and was preparing to leave when the door opened. She recognized him in the doorway before she fully processed what she was seeing, and then she processed it all at once: the drawn Colt, the tension in his frame, the fact that Holt Ferris, who was indeed behind the bar, had gone the color of old chalk. The room became a held breath, and Mary Whitaker sat still, because flinching would not help anyone and because something in her recognized, even in that fraught instant, that Marcus Quinn's presence, even armed, even furious, was not a threat to her. She watched him lower the gun slightly and find her face, and she watched his expression do something complicated she could not name. Then Holt Ferris spoke in a strangled voice from behind the bar. "Quinn, I told you I never signed anything over to Crane. He must have forged it." "The document has your signature," Marcus said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He was still looking at Mary. Then he looked away deliberately and focused on Ferris with the same quality of absolute attention. "Your signature on a deed transfer that gives Crane access to the South Water right on my property. Without that water right, I cannot keep cattle through the summer. You know what that means." "I never signed it," Ferris insisted, and there was enough naked terror in his voice that Mary thought he might actually be telling the truth. She set her glass down. "Mr. Quinn," she said. Every head in the room turned. The way she said it was not loud or theatrical. It was simply clear and direct and contained no fear whatsoever, which made it more commanding than any shout. Marcus looked at her again. "If Mr. Ferris did not sign that document, then someone forged his signature," she said. "A gun in that situation is a solution to the wrong problem. The solution you need is a handwriting examiner and a competent lawyer who has already been made aware of Crane's tactics." She held his gaze. "You have one of those." The silence stretched. Then one of Marcus's ranch hands, who had come in behind him and was standing rigid near the door, let out a careful breath. Marcus holstered the Colt. He did it smoothly, without drama, without making it seem like a concession, but it was one. He walked to Ferris's position behind the bar and leaned both hands on the counter. "If you did not sign it," he said quietly, "I need to know everything you know about how it came to exist." Ferris nodded so fast his jowls shook. "Come to my office tomorrow morning. I will tell you everything." Marcus straightened, turned, looked at Mary one more time with that expression she could not entirely decipher. Then he walked out. The room exhaled entirely. Tibbet leaned close to Mary and said in a low, wondering voice, "Every other woman in this room, including myself, was halfway under the table." "The table would not have helped," Mary said, but she said it gently because was a kind woman, and then she picked up her fabric and her bag and walked out into the cooling evening air of redemption. Marcus was standing outside, a little apart from the street, looking at the sky as though the stars that were just beginning to appear had something useful to tell him. He heard her step and turned. "You intervened," he said, not accusatory, wondering. "You were going to make an irretrievable mistake," she said. "I dislike irretrievable mistakes." He looked at her for a long time and she let him look, and the evening sounds of redemption went on around them, a horse at the hitching rail, voices from inside the saloon returning to something resembling normal, the distant barking of a dog. "You were not afraid of me," he said. "No," she said. "Most people are." "I noticed," she said. "I think that causes you some loneliness." He went very still in the way he went still when something landed on him with unexpected accuracy. She had learned his stillness by then, though she had not named this learning to herself. "I owe you a significant debt," he said. "You owe me nothing," she said. "Just do not go pointing guns at cattle brokers in the future. Handle it with Clara Birch." The corner of his mouth moved. That quiet, precise humor. "Understood," he said. She walked home. She walked home and sat at the small desk in her room with the lamp turned up and tried to account honestly to herself for what she was feeling, and found that she could not dismiss it cleanly any longer. It was not just empathy for a man in an unjust situation. It was not just professional interest in whether the right outcome prevailed. It was something specific to him. The way he listened, the way he looked at her as though she was the most interesting problem he had encountered in years, the way the room organized itself around him, and how he seemed entirely unaware of this, or at least indifferent to it. She did not write any of this in the letter to Clara Birch that she drafted that night. That letter was strictly about Holt Ferris's evidence and the forged signature and the handwriting analysis Clara should arrange. Mary was a practical woman who dealt in useful information. She went asleep thinking about the way he had said, with an honesty that seemed almost involuntary, that most people were afraid of him, and the way he had not flinched when she said it caused him loneliness, as though her naming it had been a relief rather than a wound. The weeks that followed were the most complex of Mary's life in redemption, and not only because the legal situation with Sela's Crane was accelerating toward its crisis point. Clara Birch arrived from Fort Worth on the 1st of November, a composed, sharp-minded woman of 34 who assessed the situation quickly and set to work with formidable efficiency. She arranged for Holt Ferris's testimony, commissioned a handwriting examination of the disputed deed by an expert in San Antonio, and filed an injunction that temporarily halted any transfer of water rights pending the hearing. She also looked at Mary and Marcus with the observant eyes of someone who processed information for a living and said nothing, which Mary respected enormously. Marcus came to Dr. Pratt's office regularly now, not always for medical reasons, and Dr. Pratt accommodated this with a straight face and the occasional meaningful glance in Mary's direction that she pretended not to notice. Marcus would appear in the late afternoon, often bringing documents or updates about the legal proceedings, and they would sit at the small table in the front room while Dr. Pratt was conspicuously occupied in other parts of the house, and they would talk. They talked about Crane and the railroad and the law, but they also talked about other things. He told her about the ranch, the way his father had arrived in Texas with $12 and a horse, and spent 30 years turning a dry, hard piece of land into something that could sustain a family. He talked about his father with a quiet reverence that was not maudlin, a simple, deep acknowledgement of a debt that could not be repaid, only honored. "You are honoring it," she said, "by fighting for it." "Sometimes I wonder if fighting is the right form of honor," he said. "My father was not a man who fought, he built. He was patient. I am not always patient." "You were patient enough tonight to put that gun away in the saloon," she said. "When I think about what could have happened." He met her eyes. "You stopped me," he said. "Not just your words. You." She held his gaze. "I was not going to let you ruin yourself over a forged piece of paper," she said. "No," he said. "You were not." The way he said it held something she felt all the way through. "Why does that matter so much to you?" It was the most direct question he had yet asked her about herself, and she sat with it for a moment, giving it the honesty it deserved. "Because I have watched too many good people be destroyed by the decisions they make in their worst moments," she said. "My father made such a decision, the year before he died. He was angry at a man who had cheated him in a business transaction, and he responded in a way that cost him everything he had worked for. Even before the typhoid took him, he was already gone in the ways that mattered." She paused. "I do not want to watch that happen to someone else I care about." The words settled between them. She had said someone I care about, and she had meant it, and they both knew she had meant it, and neither of them moved for a moment. "Mary," he said, and her name in his voice had a quality it had not had before, not quite more gentle, more honest maybe, more present. "Yes," she said, which was not quite an answer to anything he had said, but was an answer to what she heard underneath it. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was the most natural thing, a simple, certain contact that asked nothing theatrical of either of them, and yet rearranged something fundamental in the room. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat that way for a moment, and then Dr. Pratt called from the back room asking if anyone wanted coffee, and they both laughed quietly, and the spell bent without breaking, and everything between them shifted permanently into something new. Over the next 2 weeks, as Clara Birch prepared for the hearing and Sela's Crane grew increasingly desperate and obvious in his tactics, Marcus and Mary fell into the particular rhythm of two people who have recognized each other on a deep level, and are now navigating the specific terror of caring enormously about how the other person is doing. He brought her wildflowers that grew at the edge of his property, yellow ones she did not know the name of, tough, scrubby things that bloomed despite the dry season, and left them with Dr. Pratt when she was out on calls. She left notes for him with the post office clerk, passing along useful information but also, increasingly, small thoughts that had nothing to do with Crane or land or law. She went to the ranch for the first time on a clear, cold Saturday in the second week of November. He had asked her to come not for any particular reason, but because, he said simply, he would like her to see it. She rode out with him in the late morning on horses borrowed from the livery stable. She was a competent if not exceptional rider, having learned as a girl in Missouri. And the land opened up around them as they moved northeast from town, the flat scrub giving way gradually to rougher country with more color in it, amber and rust, and the dark green of cedar. The Quinn ranch house was larger than she had expected, a solid two-story structure of limestone and timber that sat on a rise with a view in 3 directions, and had clearly been added to over decades as resources allowed. It was not elegant, but it was well built, the kind of house that said its owners had intended to stay. There were outbuildings, a barn, a bunkhouse, corrals where horses moved in the cool air. A few of Marcus's ranch hands were visible at work, and they greeted her with respectful nods and the careful neutrality of people who understood that the boss had brought someone important, but were not going to presume. Marcus showed her the land with the pride and the grief of a man who has cared for something for a very long time and lived daily with the fear of losing it. He showed her the creek that ran better than the one in town, the section that the railroad survey would cut through, the south pasture where the disputed water rights came from. She listened and looked and asked careful, specific questions, and she felt the land differently for having seen it, felt the stakes of the fight differently. On the ride back, as the sun was going lower and the cold was sharpening, he said, "Tell me about Missouri." She told him. She told him more than she had told anyone in years about the farm, the family before the typhoid, the sister she had lost as a child to a fever, the 2 years in St. Louis learning medicine from Dr. Kellerman, who had been one of the few men she had encountered who treated her as a person of genuine intelligence. She told him about the moving, the rootlessness, the way she had come to think of it as freedom rather than loss. "Do you believe that?" he asked. "That it is freedom?" She thought about it honestly. "I believed it," she said. "I am less certain now." He did not say anything to that. He did not need to. The distance between their horses was perhaps 3 feet, and it felt like the charged space before lightning, full of potential. "Whatever happens with the hearing," he said, "I want you to know that I am glad you came to redemption." "I am glad I came to redemption," she said, which was not the same sentence but landed the same way. That evening, standing at the door of Dr. Pratt's house with the night fully arrived and the temperature dropping and the stars extravagant overhead in the way they were only in open country, he took her hand again. And then, with the deliberate certainty that characterized everything he did, he said, "I intend to court you properly, Mary Whitaker, if you will allow it, not because of the situation or the timing or anything convenient. Because I have never met anyone like you, and I do not intend to waste that by being indirect about it." She stood in the cold and looked at him and felt something she had protected herself against for years open up in her chest like a window being thrown wide in spring. It was terrifying and it was right. "I will allow it," she said. He pressed her hand gently and said good night, and she went inside and stood with her back against the door for a full minute just breathing. The hearing at the county seat in Hartley was set for the 14th of November. In the week before it, Silas Crane made 2 final attempts to alter the outcome through means that were not legal. Decker, his hired man, approached 2 of the witnesses Clara Birch had subpoenaed and suggested in very clear terms that testifying would be unhealthy. One witness, a surveyor named Aldous Park, fled rather than face Decker's attention again. The other witness, Holt Ferris, came to Mary. He appeared at Dr. Pratt's office on the evening of the 11th, visibly shaking, and told her that Decker had come to his house the previous night and spoken to him for 20 minutes with a very specific kind of quiet menace. He did not threaten me outright, Ferris said, his voice not quite steady. He simply described in considerable detail what had happened to Webb, the attorney, and then he described my children, their ages, where they go to school, the route they take home. Mary listened, kept her voice level, and sent one of Dr. Pratt's young neighbor boys to find Marcus while she sat with Ferris and kept him from bolting. Marcus arrived within half an hour, assessed the situation quickly, and made arrangements. Ferris's family was moved that night to the home of a relative in a neighboring county, escorted by two of Marcus's most reliable men. Ferris himself stayed at the Quinn ranch under the protection of the remainder of the crew. It was not elegant, but it was effective. Mary was at the ranch when these arrangements were being made, and when the last details were settled, and Ferris had been given a meal and a room and enough whiskey to calm his nerves, Marcus found her in the kitchen where she had been making coffee. He looked at her across the room with the tiredness of a man who had been running on anger and adrenaline for months and was finally feeling the weight of it. "Come sit down," she said. He sat at the kitchen table. She put coffee in front of him and sat across from him. In the other rooms of the house, she could hear the low voices of the ranch hands and the distant sound of horses in the dark. "This ends at the hearing," he said. "One way or another. It ends with the truth," she said. "The handwriting analysis is unambiguous. The forged deed will not hold. Crane has influence in Hartley," he said. "I do not know how far it extends. Clara knows the judge in Hartley," she said. "She told me so. She knows him to be honest." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and looked at the surface of the liquid as though reading something there. "If this fails," he said, "I lose the ranch, not just income. The thing my father built, the thing I have spent 4 years," he stopped. "I have very little ability to imagine what comes after that." "Nothing good comes from imagining it," she said. "Save your imagination for after the hearing when it has been decided in your favor." He looked up. "You are very certain." "I am not uncertain," she said. "There is a difference." Something in his expression softened in a way she had not seen before, something behind the focused intensity, something warmer and more vulnerable. He reached across the table and tucked a strand of hair back from her face with a gesture so gentle it barely registered as physical contact at all, and yet it held everything. "I do not know what I would have done without you," he said. "And I am not only talking about Clara Birch and the documents and Ferris tonight. I mean," he seemed to search for the words with someone who was more accustomed to action than declaration. "I mean that you changed something, for me. I had been so focused on the fight that I had forgotten there was anything worth fighting for beyond the land itself." He paused. "You reminded me." She held his gaze. "You are worth fighting for," she said. "The land and the man who built what your father started." He held her gaze for a long moment, and then he leaned forward and kissed her, softly and with great care. And she kissed him back, and it was exactly as it should have been, not desperate, not rushed, honest and certain and right. When they separated, he looked at her with those dark eyes that held everything, and she felt completely found, which was a feeling she had not known she was looking for. The morning of the 14th was cold and clear. They rode to Hartley in a group, Marcus and Clara Birch and Mary and Holt Ferris, and 2 of the ranch hands as escort, on the county road that ran 20 miles northeast through country that was beautiful in its spare, winter-browned way. The frost had come overnight, and the grass was silver in the early light. Mary rode beside Marcus, and they did not talk much, but the silence was companionable in the particular way it had become between them, a comfortable space that needed nothing added to it. The hearing was held in the county courthouse, a solid stone building that housed also the sheriff's office and the county records. The courtroom was small, and the gallery was half full. Word had traveled, as it always did in small counties, and a number of Redemption's residents had made the ride, including Mee Tibbet and her husband, the general store owner Cyrus Bright, who had sided with Marcus, and several of the other ranchers whose own land claims were affected by the precedent this case would set. Silas Crane was there with his own attorney, a man from Houston named Garrett, who was well-dressed and professionally composed, and whose composure Mary noticed was slightly forced. She noted this as significant. The judge was a man named Caswell, 60 years old, with a face like weathered oak and the bearing of someone who had presided over difficult cases before, and found the difficulty instructive rather than troubling. Clara had told her that Caswell was a man of genuine legal principle. Looking at him, Mary believed it. The proceedings lasted most of the day. Clara presented the handwriting analysis first, a clear, methodical demonstration from the San Antonio expert that the signature on the disputed deed did not match Holt Ferris's actual signature in any of 6 documented comparisons. She presented Ferris's testimony, steady and specific now that his family was safe. She presented the chain of title documentation that established the validity of the Quinn land grant dating back to the Republic period. Crane's attorney argued procedural points with skill and persistence. There were moments when Mary, watching from the gallery beside me Tibbet, felt the anxiety of genuine uncertainty. Marcus sat at the plaintiff's table with his hands flat on the surface, perfectly still, his eyes on whatever was in front of him. Only she knew what that stillness cost him. At 4 in the afternoon, Judge Caswell delivered his ruling. The forged deed was nullified. The water rights belonging to the Quinn Ranch were confirmed. Crane's attempted land acquisition was found to have been conducted through fraudulent means and was voided in its entirety. Crane's attorney rose to file an appeal. Judge Caswell informed him, in the tone of a man who had covered this ground in advance, that given the evidence of document fraud, any appeal would require Crane to first answer questions in a separate proceeding regarding his knowledge of or participation in the forgery, a proceeding which the judge would refer to the district attorney's office for consideration. The room was very quiet. Silas Crane, who had arrived that morning with the bearing of a man accustomed to things going his way, sat with a particular quality of compressed fury that Mary recognized as the fury of a man who realizes his options have just run out. His attorney leaned close and whispered something. Crane said nothing. There would be no appeal. The ride back to redemption was different from the ride out. The cold had not changed and the country had not changed, but something in the light seemed different, or perhaps it was only that the people moving through it were different. Clara Birch rode at the front of the group, satisfied in the quiet way of a lawyer who has prepared something difficult very well. Ferris was visibly lighter, the color returned to his face. The ranch hands were talking to each other with the easy energy of men whose anxiety had been allowed to discharge. Marcus rode beside Mary, and about 5 miles out of Hartley, when the group had stretched enough that they had a particular kind of privacy in their portion of it, he said, "I owe you an impossible debt." "You owe me nothing," she said, as she had said before. "The difference," he said, "is that this time I intend to argue." She looked at him, surprised by the light quality in his voice, and found him looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him yet, unhidden and warm and direct. It made him look younger. It made him look like the person she suspected had always been there under the armor. "Argue away," she said. "I intend to," he said, "for a considerable length of time. Possibly decades." She felt the warmth of that spread all the way through her, and she laughed, genuinely and without reserve, which was a thing that came from deep in the center of her, and startled even her a little with its fullness. He looked at her laughing, and his expression became simply honest. "Marry me," he said. "Not because of the hearing or the gratitude or any of the events of the last 2 months. Because you are the most remarkable person I have ever met, and I am not interested in continuing to live in a world where you are somewhere else." The horses moved forward under them, and the cold air moved around them, and the winter grass ran in every direction under the pale sky, and Mary Whitaker, who had been moving from place to place for 7 years telling herself that rootlessness was freedom, and that needing no one was a form of strength, felt the truth of both those beliefs dissolve quietly and without regret. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He leaned across from his horse and kissed her, briefly and with complete certainty. And me Tibbet, who was riding close enough to see this happen, made a sound of profound satisfaction that carried clearly in the cold air and made both of them laugh again. They were married on the second Saturday in December, in the church that was also the school, with Dr. Pratt conducting an informal ceremony since the circuit preacher was not due until January, and waiting that long struck both of them as unnecessary. Clara Birch stayed for the occasion, standing beside Mary as her witness. Nearly all of Redemption attended, including Holt Ferris, who appeared with his family returned safe from their relative's house and brought a substantial ham as a wedding gift. Silas Crane had left Redemption 2 weeks after the hearing, quietly and without ceremony. Decker, his hired man, had departed even before that, apparently understanding that the environment was no longer hospitable to his particular skill set. Eloise Crane, who visited Mary twice more after her husband's departure to inquire about her headaches, and Mary suspected, to process the shock of discovering who her husband had been, eventually returned to Houston with her children and wrote Mary a letter 3 months later that was careful and brief, but genuinely kind. The church was cold despite the fire in the iron stove at the front, and Mary wore her blue dress altered and pressed, with a sprig of cedar pinned to her collar, and she stood across from Marcus Quinn and looked at him with the same steadiness she had looked at him with on the evening. He walked through the saloon door with a drawn gun, and he looked back at her with the same quality of absolute attention that had been his since the first moment he saw her, except that now there was nothing in it of danger or guardedness. Only the open, certain recognition of a man who has found the thing he was looking for without knowing he was looking for it. "I do," she said, clearly and without hesitation. "I do," he said, in the voice that she had come to think of as the most honest sound she had ever heard. Dr. Pratt pronounced them married with visible emotion, and the assembled crowd of Redemption offered a warmth that was not complicated or obligatory but genuine, the pleasure of people who were glad to see two good individuals find each other. The winter settled in fully after that, and the months that followed were the most content of Mary's life since childhood, which did not mean they were without difficulty. They were adults with strong views and independent habits, and there were evenings of heated disagreement and mornings of careful repair, and the ranch had its own relentless demands of weather and season and the business of livestock and land. But the difficulty was the kind that came from two people genuinely engaged with each other and their shared life, not the kind that comes from fundamental incompatibility. She continued working for Dr. Pratt through the winter and into the spring, though with the reduced hours of a woman who had her own house to run and a husband who, while he never asked her to stop working, was not above expressing openly that he liked it when she was home in the evenings, and he would not pretend otherwise. She respected the honesty of this and met it with her own, that she needed her work, that being useful in a medical capacity was a part of who she was, not something she was willing to surrender for domestic comfort, and that she trusted him to understand this. He understood it. By April, Dr. Pratt had engaged a second nurse, a young woman from Abilene who had trained at a similar institution to the one Mary had attended, and this allowed Mary to reduce her hours further by genuine choice rather than circumstance, which felt different. She worked 3 days a week at the practice and spent the other days at the ranch, learning the rhythms of the land that Marcus had grown up with and she was growing to love. There was a morning in late April when the whole country smelled of rain that had not yet arrived and the light was extraordinary, that particular golden green of spring on the Texas plains, and she was standing at the north fence line, watching the horses move across the pasture when Marcus appeared beside her, having come up from the barn without her hearing him, and he stood next to her looking at the same thing she was looking at. "Tell me what you see," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "The creek is running better this year than last," he said. "The mares are all in good condition. There is a hawk nested in the cedar brake on the rise." A pause. "I see what my father saw when he chose this land. I think I see it more clearly now than I did before. Before what? She asked, though she suspected she knew. Before you, he said simply. She leaned against him and his arm came around her, easy and natural, the way things were between them now, not dramatic, not self-conscious, simply true. Marcus, she said. Yes, I am going to have a baby. The silence that followed was the particular kind that surrounds a statement of enormous weight, and she felt him absolutely still against her in the way she knew. And then he breathed out and held her closer, and said nothing for a long moment because there was nothing adequate to say. Then he said, "When?" "November," she said. He turned her gently so she was facing him and looked at her with the expression she had been collecting quietly for the past 5 months, the one that contained everything he felt and did not feel the need to make smaller for comfort. "Are you well?" he asked, and the question was a medical one and also a much larger one. "I am very well," she said. He held her face in his hands with a care she would never entirely stop being moved by, and kissed her forehead and then her mouth and said against her hair, "This land is going to be his." "His," she said. "You are already certain." "No," he said, hopeful, a pause and the humor she loved. "Though I would be equally pleased with any other arrangement." She laughed and the horses moved across the pasture, and the hawk lifted from the cedar brake on the rise, and the spring smell of rain finally arrived in a cool gust that moved the grass in long silver waves, and Mary Whitaker Quinn stood in the center of all of it and felt, for the first time in her adult life, that she was exactly where she belonged. The summer of 1879 passed in the slow gold rhythm of ranch life at its best. The work was hard and constant, the days were long and hot, the evenings were incomparably beautiful, and Mary and Marcus moved through all of it with the particular ease of two people who have grown genuinely compatible with each other's ways. She learned things that no medical training had prepared her for: how to read weather from the color of a sunset, how to gauge a horse's mood from the angle of its ears, how to get along with ranch hands who were sometimes taciturn and always observant. He learned to ask her opinion before making decisions that affected the household, and to mean the asking, which was sometimes a discipline for a man who had run things alone for 4 years. They both learned the harder and more important lesson of how to apologize without pride getting in the way of it. Clara Birch wrote in June with the news that Silas Crane had in fact been charged by the district attorney in Houston with fraud and conspiracy, arising partly from the Hartley proceedings and partly from similar activities in 2 other counties, where his land acquisition schemes had followed the same pattern. His legal troubles were considerable, and his business interests in the Texas rail corridor had collapsed. Clara wrote this with appropriate legal neutrality, but Mary could read the satisfaction between the lines, and she shared it. She wrote back with the news about the baby. Clara's response was warm and delighted and contained, in a characteristic way, several practical recommendations about medical care during pregnancy that reflected her tendency to show affection through useful information, which Mary found deeply endearing. In August, Marcus began work on adding a room to the 2nd floor of the ranch house, a project he undertook with the help of 2 of his ranch hands and one of the Tibbet boys from town who was handy with timber framing. Mary watched this construction with a mixture of amusement and deep feeling. He was building space for their family with the same quality of deliberate, permanent intention that characterized everything he did. Not the panicked urgency of a man responding to circumstances, but the patient investment of a man planning for something that would outlast him. "You have planned the dimensions very carefully," she said one evening, looking over the measurements he had sketched. "I planned for 2 rooms," he said. She looked up. "2. Eventually," he said. She looked at him and he looked back, and she shook her head slowly, smiling, and he allowed himself the small smile in return that was one of his most precise and genuine expressions. November arrived cold and the birth was a hard one, as first births often were. Dr. Pratt presided, and Mary, who had assisted at many deliveries, discovered that experiencing one from the other side was a very different education. Marcus waited in the front room below in a state of controlled fear that his ranch hands, gathered outside in the cold because no one had gone home, recognized in him and met with their own quiet version of the same thing. The baby was born in the early hours of the 9th of November, 1879. A boy, exactly as Marcus had hoped, though he would have been equally grateful for any outcome as long as Mary was safe, which she was, exhausted and extraordinary. Marcus came upstairs when Dr. Pratt allowed it, and stood at the bedside looking down at his wife and his son with an expression Mary would remember for the rest of her life. Not triumph, not simple joy, but something much deeper and more grounded, a man seeing the full extent of what he had been given and understanding it completely. "Hello," he said softly to the small person in the blanket. The small person made a sound that was not yet language but was unmistakably a response. Marcus looked at Mary. "He is listening," he said. "He is your son," she said. "He is paying attention." They named him Thomas James Quinn, Thomas for Marcus's father, James for Mary's own father. A man whose story had ended badly but who had been, in his better years, a good man, and who deserved to be remembered in the way that a grandchild's name remembers. Redemption changed over the years that followed in the way that small frontier towns changed during that era. The railroad, rerouted to miss the Quinn land and several other contested parcels, came through on a track 10 miles north of town instead, and the surveying camp became a small settlement that grew faster than redemption itself. Several businesses relocated. New ones opened. Dr. Pratt finally retired in 1882 and left his practice to the younger nurse and a new doctor who had arrived with the railroad expansion. And Mary helped with the transition and then stepped back from clinical work. Not permanently, but for the years when Thomas was small and the ranch demanded much, and she found that she had enough richness in her daily life to fill the space her work had previously occupied. A second child came in 1882, another boy they named William almost immediately, who had Mary's dark hair and Marcus's absolute attention, and the personality of neither of them, being from infancy a sociable, cheerful, noisy presence that made everyone in the house laugh more frequently. Thomas was a thoughtful, quiet 3-year-old who regarded his brother with the seriousness of someone trying to understand a phenomenon, which made Marcus understand that his elder son was very like himself, which he found both moving and cautionary. In 1884, a daughter. They named her Alina, and she was from the beginning fierce and curious and entirely herself. And Marcus, who had grown up as an only child and had no template for daughters, fell completely and helplessly devoted to her within approximately the first 48 hours of her life, a fact he never tried to disguise, and that Mary found one of the most endearing things she had ever observed. The ranch grew in those years, careful expansion rather than ambition for its own sake. Marcus had learned from his father's approach, and from his own near loss, that what you built was worth less than how you built it, and he ran the Quinn Ranch with the same principled consistency he brought to everything. His reputation in the county changed over the decade, not that people stopped finding him formidable, but the fear that had once dominated that impression gave way to something more like respect, the specific kind that came from watching a man consistently do what he said he would do and consistently treat the people around him with fundamental fairness. This was partly him and partly, as he knew and acknowledged freely, Mary. She had a way of seeing people with the same clear, steady gaze she had turned on him that first evening, the look that assessed without judgment and found without condescension, and people responded to it. The ranch hands stayed for years because she treated them as individuals whose lives mattered outside their work functions. The neighboring ranchers trusted Marcus's word in large part because his wife was someone whose word they would have trusted with anything. Even me, Tibbet, who had known everyone in Redemption for 20 years and distributed social authority accordingly, said that Mary Quinn was the most genuinely respected woman in the county, which coming from me was a statement of considerable authority. On a spring evening in 1885, 6.5 years after their wedding, Marcus and Mary sat on the porch of the ranch house after the children were in bed, watching the last of the sunset over the west pasture. The light was the specific amber of late spring, and the air had the warmth of a season well established, and the sounds coming from inside were the settling sounds of a house in which 3 children had finally gone to sleep. "I have been thinking," Marcus said. "About what?" she asked. "About the evening at the saloon," he said. "The first time I was properly conscious of you," she smiled. "You had your gun out," she said. "Yes," he said, "and every person in that room was frightened, and you were just—" He stopped. "Sitting there," she offered. "Looking at me," he said, "like you saw me, not the gun, me." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the horizon. "I did see you," she said, "very clearly." "I know," he said. "That was the thing I could not forget. I have never been seen so completely by someone who had every reason to look away." She turned to look at him in the amber light and found him looking at her with the same quality of attention he had been paying her since the beginning, that had not diminished and had not changed its character, only deepened as the years gave it more material to work with. "I was not going to look away from a man I had already decided was worth looking at," she said. "When had you decided that?" he asked. There was the slight humor underneath it. "Before you walked through the door," she said. "Based on available evidence." "That is a very practical basis for beginning to care about someone," he said. "I am a practical woman," she said. "You have known this from the start." "I have known it from the start," he agreed. "It was one of the first things I was grateful for." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat with the sunset going through its last transformations, and the land settling into its evening quiet around them, and everything that had been between them from that first charged moment, the recognition, the trust, the fear of losing it, the decision to fight for it. The life built from that decision was present in the simple weight of her head on his shoulder and the simple certainty of his arm around her. Inside the house, Elena, who was 1 year old and had recently discovered that crying brought company, offered a brief experimental sound. It was followed by a long silence and then Thomas's low voice, 7 years old and already with the quality of reassurance in it, talking to his sister through the wall of their adjoining rooms. And then quiet. Marcus and Mary exchanged a look in the dusk. "He is going to be all right," Mary said, not needing to specify which child she meant because they both knew. "He already is," Marcus said. The stars were coming out over the Texas plains, the same extravagant overflow of light that she had seen on the night he asked to court her, and the land ran away in every direction with the particular beauty of a place that has been worked and loved and defended, and is still, against the odds, standing. Mary thought about all the places she had passed through in the years of her rootlessness, about the conviction she had carried that needing nothing and no one was a form of freedom rather than a form of loss. She thought about Dr. Pratt's warning on her first day, and the way she had absorbed it as information rather than caution. She thought about the moment in the saloon when every other person had flinched and she had not because she was braver or stronger, but because something in her had recognized, even before she had language for it, that the man in the doorway was not a danger to her but a question she was already beginning to answer. She thought about what a question answered well made of your life, not an ending but a beginning, the specific beginning that came from choosing something true. "Marcus," she said. "Yes," he said, in the voice she had come to think of as the most trustworthy sound she knew. "I am very glad I came to redemption," she said. He held her closer, his chin resting lightly on her hair, and looked at the same stretch of night sky she was looking at. "You already said that," he said, "years ago, when you had only just arrived and you said you were glad you came." "I know," she said, "but I had no idea then how right I was." He pressed his mouth to the top of her head, which was a gesture that had never become ordinary to her no matter how many hundreds of times he had done it. "Neither did I," he said quietly. "But I am beginning to understand the full extent of it." The evening held them in its particular stillness. The Texas night complete around the small lit house on the rise with its view in 3 directions and its limestone walls that had been built to last. And inside those walls, the evidence of everything 2 people had made together from a moment of recognition and the decision not to look away. From the upstairs room, Alina made a sound of pure contentment, the sound of a child fully at ease in her world. And then there was nothing but the night sounds of the land wind in the cedar brake, the horses quiet in the pasture, the distant sound of the creek running well in a year of good rains, and the 2 people on the porch of the Quinn ranch house, leaning into each other in the dark, having already found everything there was to find in each other and continuing to find it still. Thomas Quinn, 7 years old, lying in his room with his eyes open and watching the square of starbright sky through his window, thought about what it meant to be brave, which was something he thought about often. He had heard the story in pieces and imprecise fragments over the years of the night his father had walked into the dusty river saloon with a gun and his mother had not flinched. He had asked his father once what that meant, why it mattered. His father had been quiet for what felt like a long time before he answered. It meant, his father said, that she saw the man and not the fear, and that changed everything. Thomas had thought about this, and thought it was perhaps the most important thing he had ever been told. Outside on the porch, unaware that their eldest was still awake and listening to the night, and constructing his understanding of courage from the materials his parents had given him, Marcus and Mary Quinn sat with the full weight of what they had built and the full warmth of what they had found, and the story that had begun with a gun and a steady gaze, and the singular fact that she had not flinched, not in fear of him, and not in fear of anything that might come from knowing him, had arrived at exactly the place such stories deserve to arrive, complete and still continuing and thoroughly, lastingly good. The years ahead would hold the ordinary extraordinary things, Will growing up to be the loudest and most beloved person in any room he entered, Alina growing up to be the fiercest and most determined, Thomas growing up to be the kind of quiet, principled man who made the world slightly more fair by moving through it. Marcus and Mary would have disagreements they would resolve and problems they would solve and seasons that would test them and seasons that would reward them. And through all of it they would be, in the clearest and most fundamental sense, each other's. And in Redemption, Texas, which had never entirely managed to live up to its name until the people who lived there gave it the chance, the story of Marcus Quinn and Mary Whitaker became the kind of story a town keeps because it needs to know what is possible, the story of a man who walked through a door expecting fear and found instead the one person who looked at him clear-eyed and without flinching, and who was wise enough to never forget it, and brave enough to let it become his whole life.